Well, good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. Catherine, je suis vraiment ravi.
Catherine, I'm delighted to host you here at the State Department and in Washington.
To have my friend and colleague, Catherine Colonna, the French Foreign Minister, here in Washington and at the State Department. This is actually the first time that we've had the honor of hosting our French colleagues and Catherine here in Washington, despite the fact that we have been closely collaborating over these past 5 months, everywhere from Brussels to Bali, most recently at the United Nations Security Council in the course of a ministerial that the Foreign Minister presided over on Ukraine. On virtually every issue that matters to our nations and matters to much of the world, I couldn't ask for a better partner. The United States couldn't ask for a better partner, and that was reflected in, as usual, the very productive conversation and meeting that we had today. We discussed our united and unwavering response to President Putin's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. In recent days, we've witnessed Moscow's widespread strikes on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, many carried out using drones supplied by Iran. These strikes have a clear goal: to make the Ukrainian people suffer. And the damage they're inflicting will make it harder for Ukrainians to heat their homes, find safe water to drink, access the electricity that they need to run everything from stores to hospitals to public transportation. President Putin thinks that these attacks will somehow break the will of Ukrainian people. Instead, he is only deepening their resolve to defend their country. Moscow can knock out the lights across Ukraine, but it cannot, it will not, extinguish the Ukrainian spirit. President Putin thought he could divide the transatlantic alliance. Instead, he's brought us even closer together. The United States is working closely with France and other European allies to help make the decisive shift away from dependence on Russian energy. That means developing more diverse, more reliable, more sustainable sources over the long term and helping our friends get through a winter with heavy energy costs. As I assured the Foreign Minister today, we are not leaving any of our friends out in the cold. President Putin thought that he could wear down global support for Ukraine. Instead, countries in every region recognize that when the Kremlin tries to redraw the borders of its neighbor by force, it threatens the rules that underpin security and stability for all nations in every corner of the earth. That is why 143 countries recently voted at the United Nations to condemn Russia's sham referenda and reject any attempt to annex Ukrainian territory. President Putin's declaration of martial law in parts of Ukraine that Russia purports to annex is just his latest attempt to dress up crimes in the language of law. His move also reveals the lie at the heart of Russia's purported annexation. If 99% of people in these parts of Ukraine want to be part of Russia, why does President Putin have to impose martial law to control them? The Foreign Minister and I spoke about how we can continue to provide robust support for Ukraine's efforts to defend itself and to deliver vital humanitarian aid to the Ukrainian people, while also continuing to raise the costs on President Putin and his enablers for their actions. And we reaffirmed our commitment to meaningful diplomacy that can bring an end to the war, even as Moscow continues to demonstrate through its escalatory actions that its claim to be open to diplomacy is as hollow as it's been since President Putin launched his invasion in February. We applaud France's security assistance to Ukraine, including President Macron's recent announcement of a 100 million euro fund to help supply Kyiv with weapons. France has also hosted more than 100,000 Ukrainian refugees, including thousands who've been welcomed into French households. Of course, our cooperation and our conversation extended far beyond Ukraine today. We're working closely together to rally international coalitions to meet global challenges, which no nation, or even group of nations, can solve alone. That includes our joint efforts to combat the climate crisis. Next week, we'll hold the second annual high-level meeting of the U.S.-France Clean Energy Partnership, which is ramping up our renewable energy production. We're stalwart partners in strengthening global health security, as was evident in France's pledge of nearly $1.6 billion at last month's Global Fund's 7th Replenishment Conference, which President Biden committed to work with our Congress to contribute $6 billion to that fund. This is the international fund that has done so much over so many years to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, saving literally millions and millions of lives. Our contributions, the United States and France, to the two largest contributions of any two countries, will allow us to keep making great strides against HIV/AIDS, against malaria, and against tuberculosis. We're also working together to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific, where all nations can choose their own paths, free from coercion. And I thank the Minister for France's support in the negotiations that the governments of Israel and Lebanon reached a historic agreement to establish a permanent maritime boundary between their two countries. This cooperation, coordination between France and the United States was instrumental in reaching this agreement. Our relationship is the embodiment of the approach in the the United States' new national security strategy, which is rooted in strengthening our alliances and our partnerships, finding new ways to weave them together, and working together to shape a more open, secure, and prosperous world. The state visit by President Macron in December, the first that President Biden will host during this administration, is both a testament to our unique friendship and a chance to continue to deepen it. I'm very much looking forward to working with Catherine in the lead up to the visit and long after it. With that, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État, dear Tony. Thank you very much for your warm welcome and for our meeting today, the first in Washington, as you rightly said. As some of you may know, I've happily served as a young diplomat in DC some time ago, let's say. Let me turn to French, since the Secretary of State is an accomplished French speaker. Monsieur le Secrétaire d'État, cher Tony, cette visite
Secretary of
intervient à un moment
State, dear
déterminant.
Tony, this visit is taking place at a decisive time. Almost 8 months ago, Russia brought war back to the European continent by invading legally Ukraine. It is, by doing so, threatening our collective security, breaching the fundamental principles of the Charter of the UN, and as well as its own commitments, and day after day, trampling upon the laws of war and international humanitarian law, given the crimes it perpetrates. The international order we build collectively is being attacked. It is therefore not a regional stake. That war concerns us all, as the Kremlin is blackmailing the world on energy, food, and in addition to its attacks against the very same principles that allow the states, the members of the international community, to live together, like I said before. This is the reason why we, France, the United States, our allies, our partners, made the choice to provide our support to Ukraine by mobilizing all of our levers, political, economic, financial, humanitarian, and military. We said it on a number of occasions, and let me repeat it here. We will stand by Ukraine as long as necessary, because such is the interest of Europe, such is the interest of the United States, and such is very simply the interest of the world, which Russia is seeking to divide by expanding its imperialist and colonial ambitions. We find strength and efficiency in our unity. The United States, once again, was here at a historical moment, standing by its European friends who share the same democratic values, standing in solidarity with the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces to allow them to resist, and as we've seen for a few weeks, to even counterattack. And I would like to mention not just our unity, but also another outstanding unity, and underline the fact that the European reaction was historical, because confronted with an unprecedented challenge, the European Union was able to use, and quickly so, its full economic, diplomatic, and military strength. We very quickly mobilized all of our instruments to hinder the Russian war effort. We enacted sanctions, individual sectorial sanctions, massive ones, 48 hours after the invasion, and 7 times in a row since then, given that we even adopted the next package of sanctions. And on Monday, together with my colleagues of the European Union, we also decided to already work on another set of sanctions in case they were necessary. And together with the Europeans, we also decided to gradually put an end to our emergency dependency vis-à-vis Russia, which was structural and which we
Comme le président Macron l'a rappelé, l'exemple du gaz est très parlant puisque les Européens sont passés
recalled by
de
President
40%
Macron,
de dépendance à 7%
the example of gas is
depuis
very
les décisions
telling,
prises à
given that
Versailles, en
the European
France, au
dependency
mois de
dropped
mars
from
dernier,
40
au
to
sein de l'Union européenne.
7%
Donc, en quelques mois, nous
dependency
avons
vis-à-vis
su
Russia
nous
further
adapter.
to the decision
Vous
taken
savez
at
que
the
l'embargo
Versailles
sur le
summit in
charbon
March.
est
So within a few
déjà en
months, we
place
were
depuis
able
le
to
début du mois
adapt.
d'août,
As you know, the
que
embargo on
celui sur
coal
le
has been in
pétrole est
place
en
since
cours et
August.
entrera pleinement en
The
vigueur
one
le
on
5
oil is
décembre.
coming and will
Et
be
que ces mesures sont
fully in place
efficaces.
on the
Ces mesures
5th
sont
of
efficaces, je
December.
tiens à le dire,
And
parce qu'on
these
entend
measures are
parfois le
efficient. And please
contraire
allow me to say,
dans la
because
propagande du
sometimes we
Kremlin,
hear
dans
that
ceux
they're
qui la
not.
relaient.
It is part of
L'économie
the
russe
propaganda
est
by
affectée, elle
Moscow.
est en récession
But
dès cette année,
Russian
et elle retombera d'ici
economy
2 ans
is
à
impacted
son niveau
already in recession
de
this
2000.
year and will be back
Ça
to
veut
where
dire
it
20
were in
ans de perdu
2000
pour ce pays et
within
déjà
2
des secteurs
years. So
entiers de
already
son industrie
20 years lost and
en
already
difficulté,
some major
visible,
part
manifeste, et cela
of
va continuer. Je
the
pense au
industrial
secteur
Russian
aéronautique, au
sectors in
secteur
difficulty.
de l'automobile,
Armament,
mais aussi au secteur de l'armement.
aeronautics,
Donc ces sanctions
automobile.
produisent leurs effets.
So the
Au plan militaire, je voudrais souligner
sanctions
également
are
que
producing
l'action des
having an
Européens est tout
impact.
aussi
From a
déterminée.
military point of view, I would like to
L'action de
say
la
as well
France
that
aussi,
the
le président de
European
la
action
République a
is
annoncé
very
récemment au président Zelensky
determined, and
le
President
renforcement
Macron
de
recently announced,
notre aide
President Zelensky,
militaire
that we would
avec de
step
nouvelles
up our
livraisons
military
d'équipements.
assistance,
Et
delivering
vous
some
savez
new
sans doute que nous
equipment,
livrons
and you're probably aware
de
that
l'artillerie,
we are
des
delivering
missiles, des
artillery,
munitions,
missiles,
des
ammunitions,
tanks légers,
as well
des
as
véhicules de l'avant blindés, comme on dit.
light tanks.
Nous avons décidé aussi de
We also
former
decided to
au moins
train
2000
at least
soldats
2,000
ukrainiens
Ukrainian
en
soldiers
France
in France,
et nous développons une
and we are
coopération
developing
en matière de renseignement
cooperation in the
qui
field of
sera également
intelligence,
accrue et qui
which will
ira
also
plus loin.
be stepped
Donc nous
up
faisons
and
d'autre
will go
part comme il le faut
further. So
et nous le
we
faisons
are
tous ensemble. Nous
doing
poursuivons
our
aussi notre
part
soutien
as
humanitaire et
needed,
de
and we
reconstruction
also
d'urgence.
provide humanitarian
Un soutien qui
assistance
sera
and
plus
working
que jamais
on
nécessaire à
emergency
l'approche de
reconstruction,
l'hiver où il faut
and
aider
that
la
will be more
population
necessary
ukrainienne
than
à
ever.
tenir et on voit
As
que
winter
la Russie
approaches,
frappe
we need to
les
help the
installations
Ukrainian people
productrices
to
d'énergie,
continue
toutes les
to hold on good, and
infrastructures
we see that
énergétiques
Russians are
sont
targeting
affectées.
energy
Nous
infrastructure in
accueillons
Ukraine.
aussi
We are
des réfugiés.
also
La France est un peu plus
welcoming,
loin vers l'ouest,
hosting,
mais
even though France is
l'Europe accueille 10
far,
millions de réfugiés qui sont
is at
les
the
bienvenus
west,
chez nous, qui
but
rencontrent
we have
un bon accueil. Les
millions
enfants,
of Ukrainian
selon nos lois,
refugees
peuvent
who are
être
welcome
scolarisés.
in
Les
France, in
Ukrainiennes,
Europe.
ce sont surtout
The
des
kids
femmes et
can
les
go to
Ukrainiens qui
school,
seraient là peuvent
we
travailler en Europe.
mainly
Et
receive
nous apportons, et là
women
aussi c'est un
and
devoir
children.
d'humanité, un
Ukrainians
devoir de
can work
solidarité
in
tout
Europe.
simplement,
It is a matter of
que nous
solidarity,
honorons.
and
Nous
we
apportons une
are
aide
honoring
économique
it. We're
et
also
financière de
providing
plusieurs
economic
dizaines
and
de
financial
milliards d'euros à l'Ukraine,
assistance
Union
in the
européenne
dozens of
et États
billions
membres
of
réunis.
euros,
Et puis nous apportons
provided
aussi un
both by the
appui
European
concret
Union and the member states
sur le plan de la lutte
individually.
contre
We're also
l'impunité.
providing some
Nous avons été
concrete
ensemble
support when it comes
à la
to
fin
the
du mois de
fight against
septembre
impunity.
au Conseil de
At the
sécurité des
end of
Nations Unies
September, we were together
pour
at the
une réunion
UN
du Conseil,
Security
la première
Council
réunion de niveau
for
ministériel
the
depuis
first
le
meeting at the
début de
ministerial
l'invasion
level
d'Ukraine par la
since
Russie,
the invasion of
consacrée à la
Ukraine
question
by Russia.
ukrainienne et consacrée en
Dealing with
particulier
the
à la lutte contre
the
l'impunité.
Ukrainian issue,
Il fallait le
and in
faire,
particular the
et
fight
ce que
against
nous
impunity.
avons
It
entendu
was
montre que
necessary
la
to do
Russie
so,
était
and what we
particulièrement
heard
isolée.
very much showed
Nous en avons
that
parlé avec
Russia
le
is
secrétaire d'État.
very
Nous apportons notre
isolated.
soutien à la
I
Cour
was
pénale
discussing with the Secretary
internationale
of State,
et aux
we are
juridictions
providing our
ukrainiennes
support to the
pour
International
que
Criminal Court and to
les
the Ukrainian
responsables
courts,
des
so
crimes
that
perpétrés
those
en
who
Ukraine soient
perpetrate
poursuivis comme
crimes
il
in
le faut,
Ukraine
car il
are
n'y a pas de paix sans
prosecuted as
justice.
shall be, because there will be
La France
no
contribue
peace
également au
without
soutien à
justice.
l'Ukraine aux côtés de
France
ses alliés
also is
en
supporting
Europe et
Ukraine,
au sein de l'OTAN.
standing by its
Elle prend
allies,
part
European
résolument
allies, and
au
within
renforcement de la
NATO.
posture de
We
dissuasion
resolutely
et de
contribute
défense
to
de l'Alliance
strengthening
sur son
the
flanc est,
deterrence and
aux côtés
defense
de ses amis
posture
baltes, roumains
of
et polonais,
the
avec
east
des déploiements
flank.
sur le terrain.
standing by the side of our Baltic, Romanian and Polish friends by deploying some additional troops, land and air forces. And the European Union itself already released 3 billion euros. We are now at 3.5 billion euros further to the decision taken on Monday, so that what we call the European Peace Facility can provide Ukraine with what it takes to defend itself. It's basically some delivery of military equipment. It is in these circumstances and it will probably still be the case in the long run, that I came here to talk about our bilateral relationship, and in order to prepare as well the state visit of President Macron very soon in early December, thanks to the invitation extended by President Biden. And I understand that it is the first state visit organized by this administration, so please allow me to say that it is an honor, which means a lot both for my president and my country. The president said it once again when I saw him on Wednesday to prepare for my visit to Washington, D.C. So we're together preparing for this visit in early December, and we intend to use it to show how vivid our alliance is. The oldest alliance, as is customary to often say. We will be working, of course, on implementing the roadmap defined just a year ago by both our presidents in Rome in the margin of the G20 meeting in the space of energy, in the areas of space and energy, which are strategic sectors for both our countries. And more than ever, we want to build on this new impulse and resolutely move forward in order to meet the challenges around the world. Some of them are just mentioned, but so many others we need to deal with: the climate, energy, the Indo-Pacific, and the Sahel, or the fight against terrorism. So I believe that on all of these issues, our discussions enable us to show that once again there was an outstanding convergence of views. We see each other often, very often, even though I do not so often come to DC. And to conclude, the new national security strategy that was published this week here in the United States only shows that we share some very close analysis and recommendations. So in this context, we believe that this state visit will once again enable us to show how close we are, how willing we are to work together to meet all of these challenges. So once again, Secretary of State, dear Tony, thank you for your warm welcome. Thank you for our discussion earlier today, and thank you for all of the good work we've been doing for quite a while, and as our countries have been doing for a long term, since General Lafayette, George Washington, or Benjamin Franklin, and I see he's watching us and keeping a friendly eye on us. Thank you very much.
We'll now turn to questions. We'll start with Kylie Atwood of CNN.
Hi, happy afternoon, and thank you guys for taking some questions. Secretary Blinken, 2 questions, one on Iran and one on Russia. We have heard U.S. officials in recent days be very clear in saying that reviving the Iran nuclear deal isn't a focus for the United States right now. But is it even possible to salvage that deal? Is the United States willing to strike a deal with the Iranian regime after the death of female Iranian protesters and after Iranian weapon shipments to Russia? And Minister Colonna, the same question to you on the French perspective on that. Is it still in the realm of possibility that France wants to revive the Iran nuclear deal? Second question on Russia and diplomacy. This week, the Russian ambassador here in Washington spoke about a quiet channel of diplomacy that was used around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis to avoid a nuclear conflict. Then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and the Russian ambassador here were leading that channel. Has the Biden administration studied that model and considered how to replicate something similar to that going forward to try and trigger a diplomatic path out of this war? Thank you.
Kylie, thanks very much. I'm happy to start and then turn it over to Catherine. First, with regard to Iran, broadly, the JCPOA in particular. Look, right now, the eyes of the world are on the protests in Iran, the extraordinary courage of young Iranians, especially women, who are standing up at great personal risk for their basic rights, for their basic freedoms, and encountering, once again, the brutal repression of their government. And as you know, we've taken a number of steps in recent weeks in solidarity with them, in support of them, in support of every Iranian who simply wants the freedom to express their views and to have their voices heard. We've issued sanctions against the so-called morality police that are the ones who, among other things, are responsible for the death of Mahsa Amini. And of course, we've also taken steps to ensure, to the best of our ability, that through technology, Iranians can continue to communicate with one another and with the outside world. And that goes to the work that we did to make sure that we had a license in place that allows technology companies as best they can to get the necessary communications technology to Iranians. So that's where I think the world's focus is. Having said that, with regard to the JCPOA, two things. First, there's no imminent agreement, and there's no imminent agreement because the Iranians continue to inject extraneous issues into the discussions about the JCPOA. And as long as they continue to do that, there is no possibility, no prospect for an agreement. We continue to believe that a diplomatic resolution to the challenge posed by Iran's nuclear program remains the best way forward. And we continue to be determined that Iran never acquire a nuclear weapon or the capacity to build one, including the fissile material necessary to fuel one. The JCPOA, when it was in existence, was successful in putting Iran's program, its nuclear program, into a box. And unfortunately, in leaving that agreement, it's allowed Iran to get out of the box that it was in terms of its nuclear program. We continue to have an interest in seeing that program put back in the box. We continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to do that. But in this moment, there's no prospect for an agreement, again, because Iran continues to inject extraneous issues into the conversations that we've had in the European Union. Our partners, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, are all in the same place when it comes to that. Last thing I'll say on this, with or without a deal, and this was true when the deal was in effect, it's been true since the deal has no longer been in effect, with or without it, we will continue to take every step necessary to deal with Iran's activities, Iran's aggression, whether it's in the Middle East or beyond. And we're seeing that now with the provision of UAVs to Russia to help it continue its aggression against the Ukrainian people. With regard to Russian diplomacy, before I turn it to Catherine, we have been very clear that whenever we have something that it's important to communicate to the Russians, we'll do it, and we've done it. I've had occasion to speak to Foreign Minister Lavrov on specific issues that were important to our own security. Other colleagues, including the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, have communicated with their counterparts, and will continue to do that. When it comes to diplomacy to end the war, it depends entirely on whether Russia gets to a place where it's actually interested in stopping the aggression that it started. And we have seen no evidence of that in this moment. On the contrary, we see Russia doubling and tripling down on its aggression. In the last month, the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of Russians, horrifically cannon fodder that Putin is trying to throw into the war. For the 300,000 Russians that have purportedly been mobilized, more than that number have fled the country to avoid having to go to Ukraine. Second, of course, this effort to have these sham referenda and then annex Ukrainian territory, which was rejected by virtually the entire world, 143 countries. Now, a horrific bombing campaign against critical civilian infrastructure, against, as Catherine said, the facilities across the country that are trying to generate electricity and power for the country to keep the lights on, to keep people warm during the winter, brutalizing the Ukrainian people. So every indication is that far from being willing to engage in meaningful diplomacy, President Putin continues to push in the opposite direction. The fundamental problem he has is that not only are the Ukrainian people extraordinarily courageous and resilient, they're also very successful in not only repelling the aggression, but taking their land back. And it all comes down to what I've been saying for some time, which is that with the assistance that we've been providing, with the incredible courage of the Ukrainian people, the fundamental difference maker is that Ukrainians are fighting for their country, for their land, for their future. Russia is not. The sooner President Putin understands that and comes to that conclusion, the sooner we'll be able to end this war.
Riley, we need to go on to the next Foreign Minister, please.
Well, we consider and will consider every means to advance diplomacy. If we see an opening to advance it by whatever means, of course, we'll always look at it. But as I said, in this moment, Russia shows no signs of being willing to engage in meaningful diplomacy by any means.
Thank you for your question regarding Iran. I say we pretty much align on this one as well. Let me switch to French. On the GPCOA, à propos du GPCOA, le secrétaire d'État a
Regarding the
répondu en détail. Une
JCPOA,
proposition
the Secretary
a
of
été faite à
State
l'Iran
responded
à
in
l'issue
detail. A
de très
proposal
longues
was made to
négociations.
Iran further to some
Proposition
very
qui vise à
long
traiter la question
negotiations.
nucléaire
The proposal
iranienne,
aims
qui est,
at dealing with the
sérieuse, pour ne pas dire
Iranian nuclear
grave.
situation, which is
Cette
serious,
proposition, l'Iran ne l'a pas
very
encore
serious.
acceptée,
This proposal
alors
has
qu'il lui a
not so
été
far
dit clairement
been
qu'il n'y aura pas de meilleure
approved by
proposition
Iran,
sur la
even though we
table
told them there
et
would
qu'il
be
lui
no
revient
better offer on the
de prendre une
table,
décision
and that it is
et de
for, it
l'accepter. Si
belongs
le
to
peut, le
Iran
président de la
to take a
République,
decision and
le
to
président Macron, est
accept
même
this offer if
allé
they can.
jusqu'à
And President Macron
s'entretenir
went
avec le président Raisi en
as
marge
far
de l'Assemblée
as
générale des
meeting
Nations Unies à New
President
York
Raisi in the
pour
margins
vérifier
of
quelle était
the
sa
UN
disposition
General
d'esprit.
Assembly
Et
in
malheureusement,
New
nous avons
York
constaté
to
que
find
l'heure
out
n'était pas pour
about
l'Iran
his
à
mindset, and
l'acceptation
unfortunately we could only
de la
acknowledge
proposition qui avait été
that
faite. Donc,
Iran at the
à ce
moment was
pays de
not willing to
prendre
accept this
une décision.
proposal. So it is for this country to
Deuxièmement,
make a
et comme
decision.
le secrétaire d'État,
Second,
je voudrais
and
dire que
like
nous
the
sommes
Secretary of
extrêmement
State, I would like to
préoccupés
say
par
how
la
concerned we
violence
are
dont
by
il est fait usage
the
par
violence
les
that is
autorités
being used
iraniennes
by the Iranian
à l'encontre
authorities against
de manifestants
demonstrators,
pacifiques. Donc, nous avons
people who demonstrate
plusieurs reprises
peacefully.
et
So
rapidement
on a number of
condamné
occasions and
cette
quickly we
répression
condemn
brutale qui
this
s'exerce
brutal
contre les
repression
manifestants,
against
rappeler
demonstrators.
le
We
droit
also
fondamental
recalled
des
the
citoyens
fundamental
de
right
manifester
of citizens
pacifiquement,
to
d'exprimer
demonstrate
pacifiquement
peacefully,
leur
to
opinion.
peacefully
Demander
express
aussi la
their opinion.
libération de
We
nos
also
ressortissants qui sont
demanded
détenus, parce qu'il y en a
our
de plusieurs
citizens to be
nationalités, dont des ressortissants
set
français,
free.
et
There are a number of
pris
French
un certain nombre
citizens
de
being held in
sanctions au titre
Iran
de l'Union
and
européenne
others. We took a
contre
number
les
of
responsables
sanctions on
de la
behalf of the
répression.
European
Cela
Union
a été fait.
against those
Et puis
responsible
plus
for the
récemment,
repression. So
cette
that's been
semaine,
done. And more
compte
recently,
tenu
this week, given
de l'aide apportée
the
par
support
l'Iran
provided by
l'action
Iran
criminelle
to
de
the
la Russie
criminal
en
action
Ukraine,
of Russia
par le
in
moyen de
Ukraine
drones kamikazes qui ont
by
été
way of
utilisés
kamikaze
encore à nouveau il y a quelques
UAVs that were
Nous avons,
used
au niveau
again
ministériel, et
only a
c'est
few
en œuvre
days
depuis
ago.
aujourd'hui,
We
pris
have,
d'autres
at
sanctions
a ministerial level,
contre
adopted
les
some additional
responsables de ces
sanctions, and
programmes
they're now
d'armement.
in force.
Je dois rappeler que
Sanctions against
l'usage de
those
ces drones dont
responsible
il a
for these armament programs.
été fait
And let me say
à nouveau
that
cette semaine
these
contre
UAVs that were
des
used once again this week
civiles
against
ukrainiennes, des
civilian
infrastructures civiles
civil
et des populations ukrainiennes,
infrastructures
cet
and
usage est non seulement une
civilians in
violation
Ukraine.
des engagements
This is not only
de l'Iran
in breach
au titre
of the
d'une résolution
commitments
du
by
Conseil de
Iran,
sécurité,
in
mais
accordance with
constitutif de
the
crimes de
United
guerre,
Nations
puisque
Security
cibler
Council
délibérément
resolution,
des
but it is
civils
also
est constitutif
a
de crimes de
war
guerre. Voilà
crime because
pourquoi
they're
nous avons
targeting
pris des sanctions.
civilians. So this is the reason why we took sanctions.
Sébastien Blink, AFP.
Thank you. I have two questions, one for each of you. Mr. Secretary, there are currently tensions between France and Germany. Britain is in a turmoil. We have a new prime minister in Italy with a coalition who disagrees on Ukraine. Are you worried about a possible lack of cohesion within Europe at a time when cohesion is very much needed against Russia? And Madame la Ministre, is France ready to send a military force or a police force to Haiti as requested by Prime Minister Ariel Henry? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Everything I'm seeing is the exact opposite of a lack of cohesion. I think we're showing tremendous solidarity. We're showing tremendous coordination, tremendous cooperation in everything that we're doing together to support Ukraine, to continue to put pressure on Russia, as well as to shore up our own alliance, NATO, defensive alliance. We've seen that in the actions that the EU has just taken, including additional sanctions. We see it in the support that just a week ago, more than 40 countries came together through the Ramstein process to continue the coordination in supplying weaponry to Ukraine to allow it to defend itself and to take back its territory. We see it in the assistance that the European Union now is providing directly to Ukraine, including direct budgetary support that will help them get through this economic challenge that they're facing, largely because of the Russian aggression. So everything I'm seeing, both in terms of my own conversations and importantly the President's conversations with his counterpart, as well as in the action that's being taken, speaks to incredibly strong cohesion, solidarity, commitment to this common effort to help Ukraine defend itself, to stand up not only for Ukrainians against this aggression, but to stand up for the very principles that are at the heart of the United Nations Charter and that are important for countries everywhere around the world. The basic idea that one country can't change the borders of another by force, that it can't simply seize the land it wants or eliminate the independence or sovereignty of a country just because its leader so decides. Together, Europe, the United States, are standing strong in defense of those basic principles, and that's something that's important not just to our own countries, but to countries around the world. And it was further manifested by the fact that with a resolution that was led by the European Union at the UN General Assembly just a week ago, 143 countries stood up together in opposition to what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
Merci, Monsieur. Nous soutenons la
Thank you,
recherche
sir. We support
de la stabilité pour Haïti, un pays qui, une fois de
the
plus,
search for
plonge
stability
dans
for
la
Haiti, a
violence
country which
et n'est
is
pas sorti
once
de la
again
pauvreté, qui est
plunged into
désormais
violence
dans
and
une situation d'insécurité grave avec,
poverty
nous
still.
le voyons, une prise en main
And we are
par
well
des
aware
gangs
about the seriousness of
criminels
the situation,
qui ne font
which is in
qu'aggraver
the hands
sa
of
situation.
criminal
Donc,
gangs which are
je voudrais
only
saluer
worsening the
à ce
situation.
titre
So
l'adoption de
in
la
this respect, I
résolution
would like to commend
aujourd'hui
the
au Conseil de
adoption
sécurité à
today of the
l'unanimité,
Security Council
ce qui est
of the
intéressant aussi quand nous
unanimous
considérons
resolution,
l'état
and
de
it is
la
also
société
interesting
internationale.
when we
C'est un projet
consider when we
américain,
look at
donc
the
je
situation of
remercie
the global
et salue
order.
les efforts qui ont été
So I would
fournis par
like
les
to
États-Unis pour que cette résolution
also
puisse être
commend the
adoptée, puisse
efforts
être
deployed by the
adoptée
United States for
rapidement.
the adoption and the quick adoption of
Si
this
une
resolution.
force internationale d'appui à la
If an
police
international
devait
support
être
force
créée,
to the police
la
were to
France
be
y
set up,
apporterait
France
une
would
contribution par un appui matériel, vraisemblablement, dont les
probably
contours restent à définir. Mais je dois ajouter que
materially,
pour le
even though we
moment, la
still
priorité
there was
reste
equipment, we will still have to work
avancer
on
vers
the
la constitution
details.
d'une telle
But
force.
what
Et
is
donc nos
important
efforts
at
se
the moment
portent
that we
d'abord et avant tout
continue to
aux
deploy
Nations Unies,
efforts
puisque
at the United
aujourd'hui nous
Nations
ne
for
sommes
such
pas
a
encore au
force to be
point
deployed.
où nous avons pu
At the
progresser
moment,
sur ce
we're
second
not
volet
yet
des actions qui sont entreprises
where
pour
we
aider à la
should
résolution du
be,
problème en Haïti.
to contribute to resolving the problem of Haiti.
Missy Ryan, Washington Post.
Hi, thank you. You both mentioned the assistance that France is providing to Ukraine. However, there are some in the US Congress who are increasingly voicing concerns about the fact that the United States is giving so much more economic and military aid to Ukraine than many of its major allies, or than all of its major allies in Europe, while countries like France, in turn, are giving less proportionally than smaller European countries like Estonia. Mr. Secretary, do you think that larger European countries like France and Germany should be increasing their contributions to Ukraine? And also for you, Mr. Secretary, last week, President Macron, in an interview, said that France would not use nuclear weapons in retaliation for a potential Russian nuclear strike on Ukraine. Do you think it's a good idea to preemptively take that off the table? And for you, Madam Minister, can you tell us how President Macron's comments ruling out nuclear retaliation makes France and Europe safer? And do you think there should be a way to take into account the significant contributions that France and other European countries have made in taking in and taking care of Ukrainian refugees to help people in the United States, for example, understand how the contributions may not be what they seem to be on the face of them? Thanks.
Thank you, Missy. With regard to assistance to Ukraine, first, I think it's fair to say that we are making together an extraordinary collective effort. And again, you see that in the security assistance that's being provided by Europe and by the United States alike. You see it in the economic assistance. You see it in the humanitarian assistance that's being provided. And, you know, if you break it down and add it up, Europe is doing extraordinary things. I just mentioned that this week we saw the European Union moving forward with direct budgetary support in the billions of dollars for the Ukrainian government, something that we've been doing over the summer, but it's very important and very timely that Europe is now picking up this baton, very important to Ukraine as it tries to get through the winter and get through the months ahead. Similarly, when it comes to the defense support to Ukraine, I could cite what France has done and continues to do, which is absolutely vital to the Ukrainians being able to defend themselves and take back territory. That continues. We talked about it today. And the same thing on the humanitarian support. It's also true that there are literally millions of Ukrainian refugees in Europe being welcomed by a whole variety of European countries. The kids going to school, the parents being able to work and getting support, that's significant. That has to be added to the equation. So this is a collective responsibility that we are undertaking collectively. And one of the things that we're working on virtually every day is making sure that we're coordinated, making sure we're being responsive to the needs, and doing it together. So I've been impressed with this collective effort, and based on our conversations and based on conversations with other European colleagues, I have no doubt that that will continue. When it comes to nuclear weapons, two things. There has been loose talk coming from President Putin and from other Russians about this. It's the height of irresponsibility, particularly coming from a member of the United Nations Security Council. It's something that we look at very carefully and that we take very seriously, given what Russia's already done in Ukraine. We've to date seen no reason to change our own nuclear posture, but we will track it very carefully. And let me just say, for our part, I'm not going to speak for France or for anyone else, we've communicated very clearly, very directly to Russia the consequences for any use of a nuclear weapon.
Je poursuivrai sur ce premier thème, Madame, avant de vous répondre sur
I
les
shall
réfugiés,
continue with this first topic before moving on to the
en reprenant en
refugees,
écho
Madam.
de ce qu'a dit le
Echoing
secrétaire
what,
d'État,
the Secretary
le fait que
of
lorsqu'on
State
parle
just said,
d'armes nucléaires,
when one
il faut
talks about
parler
nuclear
avec une
weapons, one
particulière
should
mesure, pour ne pas
with,
dire avec
genuine,
prudence. Et donc, une nouvelle fois, je dirais simplement que nous appelons la
So
Russie
once again, I would like
à agir
to
comme
say
une
that we're
puissance
calling upon
responsable.
Russia to act as
C'est
a
une puissance
responsible
dotée
power.
et à ce titre,
It
elle a
is
des
a nuclear
responsabilités
power and
particulières.
accordingly, it has some
L'arme nucléaire, c'est une
specific
arme de
responsibility.
dissuasion.
Nuclear weapons
Et je
are,
crois qu'en rappelant
of
cela,
deterrence.
tout est dit. C'est une arme de dissuasion. Quant à la doctrine française, elle est connue, elle est fixée par le président de la République, et c'est celle-ci. Vous m'avez interrogé également, Madame, sur l'accueil en Europe de millions et de millions de réfugiés, le plus souvent des femmes et des enfants, où ils sont bien accueillis, où ils s'insèrent bien. Et non, je ne veux pas en faire un argument pour convaincre qui aurait besoin d'être convaincu qu'il faut aider l'Ukraine. En les accueillant, nous faisons notre devoir d'humanité, nous faisons notre devoir de solidarité, et c'est normal. Alors oui, il y a un coût à cela. Et pour l'accueil des réfugiés, je crois que d'ores et déjà, on a évalué à 17 ou 18 milliards d'euros. Et nous ne sommes que fin octobre, et donc tout ça va continuer. L'accueil, le poids de l'accueil que l'Union européenne permet aux États membres de soutenir, et il faudra soutenir cet effort dans la durée. Mais je n'en ferai certainement pas un argument. En revanche, oui, il faut parler des faits. Et les faits sont, comme le disait le secrétaire d'État, que la France, l'Europe en tant que telle, les États de l'Union européenne prennent leur part du fardeau, font leur devoir, consacrent d'ores et déjà plusieurs dizaines de milliards d'euros à l'aide macroéconomique, financière, de reconstruction, en aide humanitaire directe, sans faire mention de ce que représente l'accueil de réfugiés dont je parlais il y a un instant. Un dernier mot. Ne jouons pas le jeu de ceux qui voudraient nous diviser. Notre unité a été remarquable. Peut-être que la Russie ne s'y attendait pas. Elle fait notre force, elle fait notre efficacité. Donc nous souhaitons vraiment appeler l'attention des uns et des autres sur le fait que nous sommes ensemble pour faire prévaloir les grands principes du droit international et qu'un ordre fondé sur des règles ne soit pas menacé comme il l'est aujourd'hui par la Russie. Il faut être très clair sur ce qui est en jeu. Et ce qui est en jeu, c'est cela. Ce n'est pas seulement le sort de l'Ukraine ou la sécurité du continent européen. C'est vraiment l'affaire de tous et l'intérêt de tous les pays dans le monde.
We'll take a final question from Keely Sullivan, France 2.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Colonna, Secretary Blinken. Mr. Secretary, if I may, I would actually like to ask you a question in French.
Allons-y.
Ok, c'est parti. Je vous demande je vous interroge sur une question, sur une déclaration qui a été
I would like to
déclarée par la
ask
Maison
about
Blanche
a
hier,
statement
selon
that came out
laquelle
of the
il y avait
White House yesterday,
des
according to
militaires
which
iraniens
there are
qui étaient
some
retrouvés en Crimée
Iranian
et qui
military
aidaient
present in
évidemment des Russes
Crimea,
avec des frappes de drones en Ukraine.
supporting
Je
the
me demande,
Russians with a number
est-ce
of
que vous envisagez qu'il y
UAV
aurait une
strikes in
réponse,
Ukraine?
c'est-à-dire peut-être des nouvelles sanctions
Do
proposées par les
you
États-Unis
consider
ou
some
une
new
réponse
sanctions
en
by the
parallèle?
United
Et
States or
également
some
à vous,
parallel response?
Madame la ministre, je vous
Madame
pose
as well,
aussi, suite
Madame
directement
Minister,
aux sanctions qui ont été
further
approuvées
to
par
the
l'Union
sanctions approved by
européenne,
the European
est-ce que
Union,
vous envisagez qu'il y aurait un plus, une réponse
do
de
you
plus
consider something
suite à
else
cette déclaration de la Maison Blanche?
further to this
Merci.
statement
Merci
that
pour ces
came out of
questions.
the
Je vais vous
White House?
répondre en anglais si vous me permettez. First, we've been warning going back to July about Iranian plans to provide UAVs to Russia for use in Ukraine. So this is something that we have been seeing in the works, and now we're seeing in reality. Back in September, a month ago, the Russians moved UAVs that they acquired from Iran into Crimea to use against the Ukrainian people. And, as we said, Russian military personnel in Crimea have been piloting these Iranian UAVs, using them to conduct kinetic strikes across Ukraine, including strikes against Kyiv just in recent days, and against all sorts of civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves. That's truly deplorable. And yes, we also see Iranian military personnel on the ground in Crimea who are assisting Russia in these operations. We believe that Russia's received dozens of these UAVs so far from Iran, with more potentially in the works. But beyond consistently warning about this, going back well before the Russian aggression, we've been taking action against the provision of UAVs by Iran to anyone that's using them in an aggressive and dangerous way, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's potentially against Israel, and other countries. We've sanctioned the entities that we can find that are involved with this, their UAV networks, including sanctions going back to last October. We're interdicting the illicit traffic in arms, including UAVs, wherever we can see them, find them, and interdict them. We're doing that in coordination and cooperation with other countries. And we're continuing to build up the defenses of our partners, including in Ukraine, against the use of UAVs or any other kinds of weapon systems that Iran may be engaged in. So this is a day-in, day-out effort. It goes back a long time, but it's now spread to Ukraine through Russia, and we're determined to stand against it wherever it's happening.
Merci, Madame. Sur
Thank you, Madam.
sanctions,
As to the sanctions,
je signalais que nous avons déjà pris 8
like I
séries de
said, we
sanctions
already
contre
adopted
la machine
8 series of
de guerre
sanctions
russe
against
et
the
contre les flotteurs
Russian
de guerre,
war machine
et
and
que ces sanctions seront renforcées si nécessaire.
warmongers, and the sanctions
Je
will
rappelais
be
qu'il y a quelques jours,
stepped up
lundi,
if
nous avons décidé
necessary.
de lancer
And
un
I was saying
travail
as well that on Monday we
pour
decided
envisager
to
ce qui pourrait être fait
start
si cela
working
devait
on
être
what
nécessaire. Mais votre question portait
could be
sur
done
l'Iran et
if it
sur
were
l'Iran.
necessary.
Là aussi,
But
je
your
répéterai
question was in
ce
relation
que
to
nous avons déjà
Iran,
dit.
and here
Nous avons
again let
pris
me
contre
recall
l'Iran
what we
en tant
said
qu'Union
before.
européenne
The
des
European Union
sanctions
itself
contre les
took
responsables de la répression.
sanctions against
Et
those
puis plus
responsible
récemment,
for
cette semaine,
repression in
des sanctions
Iran, and
contre
more
l'Iran
recently this week,
en raison
sanctions
de la
against
livraison
Iran
de
due
matériel
to
militaire
the
à la
delivery
Russie,
of military equipment to
utilisé
Russia,
contre l'Ukraine,
used against
en
Ukraine,
violation des
in
engagements
breach
de l'Iran,
of
en
the
violation de ses
commitments
obligations
taken
vis-à-vis de la
by
communauté
Iran
internationale,
and its
une
commitments
résolution
vis-à-vis
du
the
Conseil de sécurité
international
qui l'interdit,
community. There
et
is
permettez-moi
a
d'ajouter,
UN Security Council
en
resolution that
complicité
prohibits
des crimes de
that,
guerre qui
and
sont
also
commis
for
par
being the
la Russie
accomplice of the
en
war
Ukraine.
crimes
Donc nous
committed
venons de le faire, ces
perpetrated by
sanctions ont
Russia
été
in
décidées
Ukraine.
lundi
So
au niveau
these sanctions
politique,
were decided at a
finalisées
political level on
hier
Monday.
et en
They
œuvre
were
juridiquement à
finalized
partir
yesterday,
d'aujourd'hui.
and they are legally enforced as from today.
Your Excellencies, that concludes the press avail.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Merci. Thanks, everyone.
Merci.